One of the people carrying the sedan hadn't been careful enough and stepped right onto an arm. Thus, they took the lead and started screaming first. In response, the crowd responsible for delivering the wife immediately exploded. A passerby from who knows where fished out a shining white broadsword before yelling, "What's wrong? Did it come?" What happened next was basically the streets becoming a complete mess. When Xie Lian once again refocused his gaze onto what had fallen out of the sedan, he suddenly realized that the separated head wasn't from an actual living person. In fact, it was the head of a wooden doll. Fu Yao once again remarked, "Too ugly." Coincidentally at this moment, the tea sommelier approached them with a copper teapot. Xie Lian remembered the tea sommelier's expression from yesterday and asked, "Mister, yesterday I saw these people making a fuss on the streets, and today they're here again. What are they doing?" The tea sommelier replied, "They're trying to die." Ha ha ha. Xie Lian wasn't surprised at his answer and thus asked another question. "Are they trying to trick the ghost bridegroom to come out?" The tea sommelier responded, "What else do you think they're trying to do?" A missing bride's father offered an extremely large monetary reward for anyone who manages to catch that ghost bridegroom and help find his daughter. This is why this crowd of people would create this disturbance and foul atmosphere all day long. The father who had offered that reward was probably that official they had previously discussed. Xie Lian took another look at that roughly made woman's head lying on the ground and immediately understood that these people had wanted to disguise the doll as a new bride. Then, he heard Fu Yao speak in a repulsed manner, "If I was the ghost bridegroom and someone gifted me an ugly thing like this, I would just wipe out this town." Hearing that, Xie Lian reprimanded him, "Fu Yao, those words aren't something an immortal like you should say. Furthermore, can you correct that rolling eyes habit of yours? It would be best if you could set some small goals for yourself first, like only rolling your eyes 5 times a day, and so on." Nanfeng spoke up as well. Even if you give him a goal of rolling his eyes only 50 times a day, he still wouldn't be able to accomplish it. At that moment, a youngster suddenly emerged from the crowd outside. Trembling with enthusiasm, it looked as if he was one of their leaders. That youngster waved his arms before yelling in a loud voice, "Listen to me, listen to me." Continuing, "Like this is completely useless. How many rounds did we make these past few days? And did we manage to trick the ghost bridegroom out?" One after another, the buff men began to grumble and agree with him. Seeing that, the youngster continued talking, "In my opinion, since we started this, we must carry through no matter what happens. It would be better to just directly rush into Mount Jun. Everyone can search the mountain before catching and killing that ugly creature. I'll take the lead. Any brave and proper man can follow me. After we kill that ugly creature, we can share the reward." In the beginning, only a few sparse men yelled in agreement. Gradually, however, the voices of agreement grew until everyone was responding in an affirmative tone. They unexpectedly sounded quite powerful. On the other hand, Xie Lian asked, "Ugly creature, mister, what is the matter behind this ugly creature they're talking about?" The tea sommelier replied, "Rumors say that the ghost bridegroom is an ugly creature that lives on Mount Jun. Because he was born too ugly, no women would like him. This is why his heart gave birth to resentment, and why he would snatch other men's brides to prevent the couples from experiencing a happy occasion." There were no records of this on the scroll given to him by Ling Wen's palace hall. Xie Lian asked again, "Do people actually say this? Isn't this just speculation?" The tea sommelier responded, "Who knows? But it is said that many people have seen the ghost bridegroom before. Something about how his whole face is wrapped in bandages, leaving only his fierce eyes uncovered, and that he cannot speak, but rather roars like a beast. Currently these rumors are circulating everywhere." Fu Yao retorted, "Covering his face with bandages doesn't necessarily mean he's ugly. It can also be because he's too beautiful, so he doesn't want other people to see him. The tea sommelier was speechless for a moment before saying, "Then who knows? In any case, I haven't seen him." At that moment, a young girl's voice emerged. Outside on the streets, she said, you guys, don't listen to him. Don't go. Mount Jun is very dangerous." The one who had spoken was the girl hiding at the corner of the street. She was also the girl who had been praying in Feng Xin's temple yesterday night, little Ying. The moment Xie Lian saw her, his face started hurting. Unconsciously, he raised his hand and rubbed his cheek. When the youngster saw her, his face turned a bit ugly. He pushed her out of the way before saying, "Us menfolk are speaking, so what is a little girl like you butting in for?" Little Ying cowered and shrank back a bit after being pushed. However, she seemed to summon up all her courage before softly speaking again. "Don't listen to him. Whether it's pretending to hold a fake wedding or searching the mountain, these tasks are all so dangerous. Aren't you just sending yourselves off to death?" The youngster replied, "You can only say these pleasant words. All of us are working together and staking our lives to help the people rid an evil. And you're just a selfish girl, one who refused to disguise yourself as a bride and sit on the sedan chair. You can't even muster up that courage, even if it could help everybody. And now, you're running over here to hinder us again. What do you want to do?" That youngster pushed the girl once for every sentence, he said. Seeing this, the people in the tea house couldn't help but frown. Xie Lian lowered his head and focused on removing the bandages on his wrist. As he did this, he heard the tea sommelier explain that young leader previously wanted to coax that girl into disguising herself as a bride. At that time, he said so much sweet words, it was like his mouth had been rubbed with honey. But after the girl refused, he flipped his face and became like this. On the street, the group of buff men also shouted, "Stop standing here and blocking the road. Go to the side, go to the side." When little Ying saw this, her flat face became completely red as tears started swirling in her eyes. She asked, Why do you have to say it like that?" That youngster spoke up again. "Everything I said was the truth, wasn't it? I asked if you could disguise yourself as a fake bride, and you wouldn't do it no matter what." Little Ying replied, "Yes, I don't dare to. However, you didn't have to tear open my dress." The moment she mentioned this, it was like she had jabbed the youngster's sore spot. He immediately jumped up and refuted. "An ugly person like you shouldn't randomly spray blood at people and accuse them. I teared open your dress. Do you think I'm blind? Who knows, maybe you just wanted to show yourself to other people, so you ripped it yourself. Who knows, your face is this ugly, even if your dress is torn maybe nobody would even want to take a look. Don't try to pin the blame onto my head." Nanfeng really couldn't continue listening to this. With a caca, the teacup in his hands cracked and broke into pieces. However, just when he was about to get up, a white shadow floated past him. And that youngster who had been holding himself up high above the girl suddenly shouted, before falling onto his butt, as blood started dripping from his fingers. No one had enough time to figure out what had happened, for he was already sitting on the ground. Thus, people thought that little Ying had been the one who had injured him. However, who knew that when they turned their gazes back to little Ying, they could no longer see her. Instead, a Taoist wearing white stood in front of her. Both of Xie Lian's hands were tucked in his sleeves. He didn't even turn around to look at the boy, and just watched little Ying with a smile, slightly bending down so he was at the same eye level as her. Xie Lian asked, "Young lady, I wonder if I could invite you inside to drink a cup of tea with me." The youngster sitting on the ground just felt as though his nose and mouth were hurting terribly. Actually, his whole face was hurting so much, it felt as if it had been smacked with a steel whip. However, the Taoist in front of him very clearly didn't have any weapons. In addition, he didn't see when the Taoist had made his move, or how he had made his move. Thus, the youngster stumbled and managed to climb up to his feet before pointing his sword at the man. This person used a demonic art. The moment the group of men behind the youngster heard the words, demonic art, they all raised their swords against Xie Lian. However, they would never have expected Nan Feng, who was behind Xie Lian, to suddenly thrust out his palm. Following another kaka sound, the pillar beside them completely collapsed. When they saw that display of divine power, the complexion of all the buff men simultaneously changed. That youngster also began mentally cowering in his heart, but he was still reluctant to admit his fault. Instead, he charged toward them as he loudly yelled, "Today I'll admit defeat here. Which Taoist path are you from? Leave your name, and in the future, we can meet again to settle this account." Nan Feng completely didn't bother to reply, but the Fu Yao beside him piped up, "Not a problem, not a problem. This person is from the Ru." Nan Feng thrust another palm at Fu Yao, and once again the two of them started fighting. On the other hand, Xie Lian originally wanted to invite the girl inside the tea house to sit for a bit, and then help her order some fruit tea and other snacks. However, little Ying rubbed away her own tears before leaving. Thus, Xie Lian could only sigh and watch her leaving back before walking into the tea house himself. When he came inside, the tea sommelier reminded him, "Remember to pay for the pillar." Thus, when Xie Lian sat down again, he faced Nan Feng and said, "Remember to pay for the pillar." Nan Feng. Xie Lian continued, "Before that, however, we should manage our proper work. Could someone lend me some spiritual power? I need to enter the spirit communication array to verify some information." Nan Feng raised his hand. The two of them clapped their hands together, establishing what was considered to be an extremely simple contract. With this, Xie Lian was finally able to enter the spirit communication array again. The moment he entered the array, he heard Ling Wen speak, "Your Highness finally managed to borrow some spiritual power. Is everything at the north advancing smoothly? How are the two small martial gods who willingly offered a helping hand?" Xie Lian raised his head. He took a look at the pillar that had crumbled because of Nan Feng, before taking another look at the indifferent Fu Yao, who was closing his eyes and meditating. Then, Xie Lian replied, "Each of the two small martial gods have their own merits, and they're both capable individuals." A hint of a smile could be heard when Ling Wen spoke again. "Then we truly have to congratulate General Nanyang and General Xuanzan, according to His Highness' words. These two small martial gods have boundless prospects. Ascending may even be an imminent event." However, a quick moment after Ling Wen finished speaking, Mu Qing's cold voice floated out. "He didn't inform me of this adventure of his and left just like that. I was truly ignorant about this." Hearing that, Xie Lian thought to himself, "You're really guarding the spirit communication array all day long, ignoring Mu Qing." Ling Wen continued to speak, "Your Highness, where are you right now? General Pei is the deity who watches over the north, and his incense there burns quite prosperously. If your Highness is in need, you could temporarily stay at one of his Mingguang temples." Xie Lian replied, "There's no need to trouble him. We didn't find a Mingguang temple in the vicinity and thus settled at a Nanyang temple. But I do have a quick question, Ling Wen, concerning the ghost bridegroom. Do you have more information regarding this case?" Ling Wen responded, "We do. Just a while ago, my palace hall gauged the rating of the ghost bridegroom. He should be of the Wrath rank. Wrath. For the demons and ghosts that wreaked havoc on the mortal realm, the Lingwen Palace Hall classified them into 4 ranks, according to their abilities. These 4 ranks were the fierce, the severe, the wrath, and devastation. Ghosts from the fierce rank had the capability to kill single targets. Severe ranked monsters could wipe out a household, while wrath ranked ghosts could massacre a whole city. And the most terrifying of them all was the devastation rank. Whenever one was born, it could destroy a country and cause suffering to the people, turning the whole mortal realm into a mess. The ghost bridegroom, hiding on Mount Jun, was actually of the wrath rank, second only to the terrifying devastation rank. Since that was the case, anyone who managed to catch a glimpse of him shouldn't have escaped unscathed. Thus, when Xie Lian retreated from the spirit communication array and informed the other two martial gods of what he had learned, Nanfeng remarked, "If that's true, then the information about the ugly creature or the man covered in bandages were just complete rumors. It's either that, or the people who claim to have seen those things instead saw something else, not the ghost bride." Xie Lian mentioned his own theory. There's another possibility. Perhaps the ghost bridegroom wouldn't, or couldn't, hurt people under certain circumstances. On the other hand, Fu Yao didn't add his ideas and instead criticized, Lingwen Palace Hall has really low efficiency. It took them this long to give us a ranking of the ghost bridegroom. What's the use of telling us now? Xie Lian replied, "In the very least, we now know the strength of our enemy. However, since we're dealing with a wrath rank, then the spiritual strength of this ghost bridegroom must be quite high. It would be impossible to deceive him with a fake person. If we want to trick him out, then we can't use the diversion tactic where the people delivering the bride to the fake wedding are disguised puppets. In addition, they cannot be holding any weapons. However, the most important aspect is that the bride must be a living person." Fu Yao spoke up, "We can just go onto the streets to find a woman and get her to be our bait." However, Nanfeng immediately rejected his idea. "We can't do that." Fu Yao asked, "Why?" "If she isn't willing, we can give her some money, and she'll be willing." Hearing that, Xie Lian cut into their argument. "Fu Yao, even if there's a woman who is willing to do that, it's best if we don't use that plan. This ghost bridegroom is of the wrath rank. If we mess up, we would be fine. However, if the bride gets taken away, a frail mortal girl wouldn't be able to escape or resist. If that really happens, she'll only have death waiting for her." Fu Yao stated, "If we can't find a woman, then we can only find a man." Nanfeng questioned, "Where are we going to find a man who would be willing to disguise himself as a?" He hadn't even finished speaking when both his and Fu Yao's line of sight started shifting over. Xie Lian was still smiling gently. In the evening, at the Nanyang temple, Xie Lian popped out of the temple with completely disheveled hair. The moment the two small martial gods guarding the temple door saw him, Nanfeng immediately started yelling curses. With a F***CK, he rushed out. Xie Lian was speechless for a moment before asking, "What's worth such a reaction?" If you asked anyone to come and see, they would be able to tell with a glance that this was a young boy with a gentle and handsome-looking face. However, that was exactly the reason for Nanfeng's reaction. For a proper and handsome boy to wear a woman's wedding dress, that image was one where many people were unable to directly look at. An example would be Nanfeng. He probably just couldn't accept it, and thus his response was that intense. Xie Lian saw that Fu Yao was staring at him with a complicated gaze. As Fu Yao gave him a once-over, Xie Lian asked, "Do you have something to say?" Fu Yao nodded before saying, "If I was the ghost bridegroom and someone wanted to gift this kind of woman to me," Xie Lian finished his sentence, "you'll wipe out this town." Fu Yao coldly corrected him, "No, I'll just kill this woman." Xie Lian smiled. "Then I can only say, it's fortunate I'm not an actual girl." Fu Yao suggested, "I think you should try going into the spiritual communication array and see if there are any heavenly officials who are willing to teach you a spell that can help you transform your body. It would be more practical that way." There were indeed heavenly officials in heaven who, because of their particular needs, were proficient in spells that transformed their bodies. However, Xie Lian was afraid that with the time left, it was already too late for him to learn a new spell. At the other end, Nanfeng returned to the temple with a green face. After he finished cursing, he had cooled down a considerable amount, a habit that was almost exactly the same as the general he served under. Xie Lian took a look at the already late night sky before saying, "Never mind. After you cover my head with a veil, it will all look the same." When he was finished talking, he began to really cover himself with his veil. However, Fu Yao raised his hand to stop him and said, "Wait a moment. You don't know how that ghost bridegroom would harm people. If he takes off your veil and realizes he was tricked, something unexpected might occur when he rages. Wouldn't that just create more problems?" When Xie Lian heard his words, he thought they were quite reasonable. However, the moment he took a step forward, he heard a ripping noise. The red wedding dress Fu Yao had found for him really did not fit. Xie Lian, the woman this dress was originally intended for, had been quite petite. When Xie Lian wore it, although the waist area was unexpectedly quite fitting, raising his sleeves or lifting his feet were actions that felt extremely restrictive. In addition, the moment he made a bigger movement, the dress would get torn apart. Just as Xie Lian started looking around everywhere to try and find what had ripped, a voice floated over from the temple doors. "Excuse me, may I ask?" The three of them turned around toward the sound. However, what they saw was a little Ying holding some folded white clothes. As she cowardly stared at them, she explained, "I remembered that I encountered you here yesterday, so I decided to come and see if I could meet you again. I already washed these clothes. I'll place them here. For both yesterday and today, thank you so much." Xie Lian was just about to give her a smile when he suddenly realized what he currently looked like. Thus, he decided to speak less so he wouldn't scare people. Who knew that not only little Ying wasn't scared of him, she even stepped forward and asked, "This is if you like it, I can help you." Xie Lian replied, "No, young lady, please don't misunderstand. I don't have this kind of hobby." Little Ying hurriedly explained once more, I know. What I meant was, if you don't mind me, I can help you. You guys want to catch the ghost bridegroom, right?" Both her tone and her head rose a bit as little Ying continued, "I know how to alter clothes. I always carry some needle and thread on me as well. Whatever doesn't fit, I can fix it. I also know how to do some makeup. Let me help you." After the time it took to burn 2 incense sticks, Xie Lian once again walked out of the temple while bowing his head. This time, the bride's veil was already covering his head. Nanfeng and Fu Yao seemed to want to take a peek, but in the end, they still decided that it was better to cherish their eyes. The sedan chair they found was at the front of the temple, and the carefully selected people who were supposed to carry the chair had long been waiting there. The moon was already high up in the night sky. Thus, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince sat onto the grand red sedan chair, clothed in a bride's wedding dress. The whole marriage sedan was covered in crimson satin. Lovely flowers, the moon, dragons and phoenixes were sewn on with brightly colored thread. Nanfeng and Fu Yao each stood on one side of the sedan, guarding the sedan from tilting to one side. Xie Lian sat upright in the middle of the sedan, swaying with the walking rhythm of the ones carrying it. In reality, the 8 people carrying the sedan were all outstanding military officials who were proficient in martial artists. In order to find people highly skilled in martial arts who could disguise themselves as sedan carriers, Nanfeng and Fu Yao directly went to that official's residence and revealed their plans. They clearly explained how they wanted to go and explore Mount Jun. Thus, without asking any more, that official immediately pulled out a row of tall and strong martial artists. However, the reason why Nanfeng and Fu Yao wanted strong fighters was not because they were hoping they could help them. Instead, they merely wanted them to be able to defend themselves and flee when the fierce ghost began fighting back. Contrarily, those 8 military officials didn't really think too highly of them. Within the government, they were all first-class experts. When weren't they the leaders or the stars of the show? Despite that, the moment these 2 little pretty boys came, they began stepping on their heads and forced them to become sedan carriers. It could be said that they were already extremely unhappy. However, their master's orders had to be followed, and thus they could only restrain the disdain in their hearts. but since they were unhappy, it was hard to avoid their anger from flaring up. This was why, from time to time, they would deliberately slip up and shake the sedan, making it jolt terribly. Outsiders wouldn't be able to tell that, as long as the person sitting in the sedan chair was somewhat delicate, they would have already vomited themselves to death. The sedan chair tilted and jolted. Sure enough, they heard the Xie Lian inside sigh softly. A few of those military officials couldn't help but secretly feel pleased. Outside, Fu Yao asked in a cool tone, "Young lady, what's wrong? Marrying at such an elderly age, you're happy to the point of tears." Indeed, when brides married, many of them couldn't help but wipe their tears and cry in their marriage sedan. As for himself, when Xie Lian heard that, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. However, when he began talking, his tone was gentle and smooth. Unexpectedly, there wasn't even a trace of discomfort as he said, "It's not that. I merely realized that this wedding procession is lacking a very important thing." Nanfeng asked, "What are we missing? We should have already prepared all the things we ought to have." Xie Lian responded with a smile, "Maids who are accompanying the marriage." The two small martial gods standing outside spontaneously glanced at each other. One couldn't tell what kind of scene they had imagined, but they both trembled violently. Fu Yao spoke up and said, "Just pretend your family is impoverished, so there isn't enough money to buy servant girls. Thus you decided to make do." Xie Lian replied, "All right." The military officials heard their impromptu, slapstick live comedy and couldn't help but smile. The dissatisfaction in their hearts had dissipated a lot, and they felt a bit closer to the other three. This resulted in the sedan chair becoming much more stable. Xie Lian leaned back once more. Although he was still sitting upright, he closed his eyes to rest. Who knew, after a short while, a child's laughter sounded near his ears, gurgling and cruel, happy and loud. The sound of laughter was like a ripple as it spread through the mountains and fields. It sounded quite ethereal, but also very strange. However, the sedan chair hadn't stopped and was still advancing as steadily as before. Even Nanfeng and Fu Yao didn't say anything, as if they hadn't noticed any abnormalities. Xie Lian opened his eyes before speaking in a low tone, "Nanfeng, Fu Yao." Nanfeng was walking on the left side of the sedan. He asked, "What's wrong?" Xie Lian replied, "Something came." At this time, their marriage procession had already entered the depths of Mount Jun. It was completely silent. Even the creaking noises made by the wooden sedan chair, the crunching noises of the dry leaves and branches under their feet, and the breathing sounds of the sedan carriers appeared too noisy in this quiet. And the child's laughter still hadn't disappeared. Sometimes it sounded far away, as if they were laughing even deeper in the mountain. Other times it sounded very close, as if they were lying beside the sedan. Nanfeng's expression became more solemn as he said, "I don't hear anything." Fu Yao also coldly spoke up, "I didn't either." As for the other sedan carriers, it was even more unlikely for them to have heard anything. In response, Xie Lian said, "If that's case, then they are deliberately only letting me hear." The 8 military officials were originally overconfident because of their high skills in martial arts. In addition, they believed that because the ghost bridegroom randomly picked brides, they were bound to return home that night without any achievements. Thus, they hadn't been fearful at all. Now, for some reason, they couldn't help but think of those 40 military officials in that wedding procession, ones that had mysteriously disappeared. Suddenly, cold sweat began appearing on some of those sedan carriers' foreheads. Xie Lian noticed someone's footsteps stagnating and said, "Don't stop. Pretend nothing happened." Nanfeng waved his hand, motioning those military officials to keep walking. Xie Lian spoke up again and said, "He's singing." Fu Yao asked, "What is he singing?" After carefully listening to that child's voice, Xie Lian began repeating the words phrase by phrase. "New bride, new bride, new bride, on the red marriage sedan, in the middle of this silent night. Xie Lian's slightly sluggish voice came out very crisp. Clearly he had been just saying those words. However, those 8 military officials felt as if they could hear a child's voice currently singing that odd song with him. It really made one's blood run cold. Xie Lian continued to speak, eyes brimming with tears. Passing the mountain's mound, under the veil do not hold the rising smile, ghost bride. Do they mean ghost bridegroom, or something else? He paused for a bit before saying, this won't work. He keeps laughing now, so the words are unclear. Nanfeng frowned. What does all of that mean? Xie Lian replied, the literal meaning. He's telling the new bride in the sedan chair that she should only cry, and that she shouldn't smile. Nanfeng corrected his previous question. I meant, what is the meaning behind this thing running over here to remind you of that? On the other hand, Fu Yao would eternally have an opposing idea. It might not necessarily be just reminding us. It could be possible that it's deliberately trying to make you do the wrong thing. Perhaps, smiling is the real way of coming out unscathed. However, its goal is to trick others to cry. It's hard to say if in the past, the other brides fell for their plans. In response to that, Xie Lian said, Fu Yao, if an ordinary bride heard this kind of voice in the middle of the road, I'm afraid she'll only be scared to death. How could she smile? In addition, whether I cry or smile, what would the worst result be? Fu Zhao responded, you'll get kidnapped. Thus, Xie Lian reminded him, isn't the purpose of our trip tonight exactly that? Fu Yao snorted, though he didn't continue to argue. Contrarily, Xie Lian spoke up again and said, also, there's something I think I should tell you guys. Nan Feng asked, what is it? Xie Lian responded, ever since I sat onto the sedan, I've never stopped smiling. He had just said this, when suddenly, the marriage sedan sank heavily. The 8 military officials began to immediately riot, causing the marriage sedan to completely halt. Nan Feng shouted, everyone, don't panic. Xie Lian raised his hand slightly. Before asking, what happened? Fu Yao replied in a light tone, nothing more than meeting some beasts. He had just finished answering, when Xie Lian heard a mournful wolf howl cut through the night's silence. A pack of wolves was blocking their path. No matter what, Xie Lian thought this wasn't very normal. Thus, he asked, may I ask, do wolf packs frequently roam Mount Jun? One of the military officials holding the carriage replied, I've never heard of this happening before. How could they be on Mount Jun? Xie Lian raised his eyebrow before saying, yeah, then we've come to the right place. It was nothing more than a pack of wolves on a mountain. They weren't something that were difficult for Nanfeng and Fu Yao to deal with. And they weren't something scary for those military officials who regularly rolled around and fought against others. But just then, they had been pondering over the ghost bridegroom's eerie song. That had been the only reason they were so caught off guard and afraid. From the darkness of the forest, many pairs of faintly green wolf eyes lit up as the wolves themselves began slowly walking out. Quickly they began surrounding them. However, when one compared a pack of beasts that happily found a meal to that thing they couldn't hear nor touch, the weird thing was of course scarier. Thus, one by one, everybody began rolling their sleeves up for battle, preparing to show their talents and go on a killing spree. Unfortunately, the best part of the show had yet to come. Tightly following their steps, a rustling noise appeared, followed by a strange voice that didn't sound human nor like a beast. A military official exclaimed in alarm, what is this? What is this thing? Nanfeng also began cursing. Xie Lian knew that something had quickly changed and thus wanted to stand up. He asked, what happened now? However, Nanfeng immediately yelled, don't come out. Xie Lian raised his hand, when suddenly, the sedan chair began to shake. It seemed as if there was something leaning against the sedan door. Xie Lian hadn't been lowering his head that much. He directed his gaze downward, before seeing the back of a head of some kind of thing from the crack between his veil. It actually climbed into the marriage sedan. That thing had stuck his head into the marriage sedan, but was immediately dragged out by someone outside. Nanfeng stood in front of the sedan and cursed FCK, "It's a base slave." As soon as he heard it was a base slave, Xie Lian knew that things would now become troublesome. According to Lingwen Palace Hall's judgment, a base slave was something that couldn't even obtain the fierce rank. It was said that originally, base slaves were human. However, if one looked at them now, even if they were people, one could only say they were deformed humans. It had a head and a face, but they looked vague and unclear. They had legs and arms, but they were too weak to walk on. They had a mouth and teeth, but it would take them forever to bite someone to death. However, if they let people choose, most people would rather meet the scarier fierce or severe ranked monsters than meet a base slave. This was because, in most cases, base slaves appeared and coordinated without other ghosts and monsters. When their prey was fighting against their enemies, they would suddenly appear. Then, they would use their endlessly tangled arms and legs to stick to their prey. They also had countless companions that advanced dauntlessly, all winding around their prey like sticky candy. Even though their combat strength was extremely low, they were very tenacious and hard to kill. Furthermore, they usually emerged in a large group. It was pretty hard to shake them off, and it was even more difficult to quickly kill them all. Gradually, one would waste too much strength fighting them, or they will end up stumbling. As a result, there would inevitably be a short moment of carelessness, one that will let the enemy who had been waiting for an opportunity to succeed. After the prey was killed by the other ghosts and monsters, the base slaves would collect the remains of the prey. Those broken arms and legs, before eating them with relish, they would gnaw and nibble until they were full of holes. Base slaves were truly a very disgusting existence. To a heavenly official from upper heaven, letting out divine light and pulling out their weapons were naturally enough to scare base slaves into retreating. However, to the small martial gods of middle heaven, these things were truly hard to deal with. From what seemed to be a distant place, Fu Yao said in a tone full of revulsion, "I hate these things the most." Did Lingwen Palace Hall mention these things? Xie Lian responded, "They didn't." Fu Yao immediately retorted, "What use do those guys have?" Ignoring him, Xie Lian asked, "How many of them came?" This time it was Nanfeng who replied, "Around 100, probably a bit more, don't come out." For things like base slaves, the more there were, the stronger they became. When there were more than 10 of them, it would already be extremely hard to deal with. More than 100 of them, there would be more than enough base slaves to drag them to death. Base slaves usually liked living in places where there were a lot of people. Thus Xie Lian would never have expected that there would be this many living on the deserted Mount Jun. Xie Lian thought for a moment before slightly raising his arm, revealing a wrist that was half bandaged. He said, "Go ahead." The moment he said those words, those white bandages began automatically sliding off his arm. Like it was alive, it flew outside bypassing the curtains of the sedan. Xie Lian sat upright in the sedan before gently ordering, "Strangle them to death." In the midst of the night, a white viper suddenly swam out. When that white, thin silk was bandaged around Xie Lian's wrist, it seemed to only be a few chi in length. However, when it flew as quick as lightning into the fight, it seemed as if it was infinitely long. With a crack, a succession of snapping sound echoed in the air. In the blink of an eye, dozens of wild wolves and base slaves had their necks broken by the white silk. The 6 base slaves, bothering Nanfeng, instantly met a violent death and fell to the ground. He thrust out his palm and sent the last wolf flying. However, though Nanfeng had escaped the danger, he didn't relax even the slightest bit. Instead, he rushed toward the sedan and yelled in disbelief, "What is that thing? Aren't you without any spiritual power, and thus can't activate magical artifacts. Xie Lian responded there would inevitably be exceptions to everything. Nanfeng was furious. He slapped one side of the sedan carriage and roared, "Xie Lian, say it clearly. What is that thing?" Is it that slap of his almost made the whole sedan fall apart? Thus, Xie Lian had no other choice but to raise his hand and support the door. But for once, he was slightly startled when Nanfeng said those words. His tone unexpectedly made him recall Fengshen's appearance when he got mad in the past. Nanfeng was still waiting for an answer when suddenly, the distant screams of the military officials echoed through the air. Fu Yao coldly said, "If you want to talk, beat back this wave of enemies before doing it." Nanfeng had no other choice but to go back and save the show. However, Xie Lian quickly snapped out of his daze and said, "Nanfeng, Fu Yao, you guys leave first." Nanfeng looked back. "What?" Xie Lian explained, "If you guys stay around the sedan chair, more things will come. You won't be able to finish fighting. In that case, take the other people and leave. I'll stay behind and meet that ghost bridegroom." Nanfeng wanted to start cursing again. "Just you." However, on the other side, Fu Yao coldly spoke up. "Since he can use that silk cloth, for a short while nothing will happen. If you have time to argue with him, wouldn't it be better spent settling that group become returning to help? I'm leaving." Fu Yao was rather confident and at ease. He was also straightforward as well. When he said he was leaving, he immediately left, not even slowing down for a moment. Nanfeng clenched his teeth, knowing in his heart that the other small martial god wasn't wrong. Thus he turned to face the remained military officials and said, "Follow me." Sure enough, when they were farther away from the sedan, though the previous base slaves and wolves were still there, no more new ones joined the fight. The two small martial gods protected for military officials. As they fought, Fu Yao began speaking with a tone of hatred. "Ridiculous. If it were not for me," he stopped talking. The two of them glanced at each other, their gazes both completely strange. Fu Yao swallowed the rest of his words before turning his head. For the time being, the two of them put away this topic and didn't mention it again. Instead, they only continued hurrying. All around the marriage sedan, corpses covered the ground. The silk rui had already strangled all the leftover base slaves and wolves that had tried pouncing onto the sedan. It flew back and began automatically and gently wrapping itself on Xie Lian's wrist once more. Xie Lian calmly and quietly sat in the marriage sedan, surrounded by the complete darkness and the rustling sounds of the trees. Suddenly, everything became completely silent. The sound of the wind, the sound of the rustling trees, the shouts of the monsters. In a split second, all of that became deathly silent, as if they were afraid of something. After that, he heard two light laughs. It sounded like a young man's voice, but it also sounded like the voice of a teenager. Xie Lian sat there and didn't speak, the silk rui wrapped around his wrist, ready to act. As long as the person who came had even the smallest trace of killing intent, it would immediately and frantically strike back with 10 times the power. Unpredictably, Xie Lian didn't meet an abrupt attack or a blast of killing intent, but something completely different. The curtain of the marriage sedan was slightly lifted. Looking through the crack of the red veil, Xie Lian saw the person extend a hand toward him. The fingers and joints of that hand were well defined. Red thread was tied around the third finger. On that slender and pale white hand, it looked as if it was a colorful and bright knot of fate. Xie Lian remained calm and collected. After all, he hadn't finished thinking things through yet. Should he continue acting mighty and unmovable despite encountering hardships? Or should he pretend to be a new bride who was currently scared out of her wits, one who would cowardly move backwards in an attempt to hide? The owner of that hand was quite patient and elegant. Xie Lian didn't move, so that hand didn't move either, as if the hand's owner was waiting for his reply. After quite a while, as if he had been possessed by a demon, Xie Lian actually reached out his hand. He stood up and was about to push aside the curtain blocking the door, so he could step off the sedan. However, the person outside was already a step ahead of him and had already raised the red curtain. The person who came held Xie Lian's hand, though he didn't grasp it too tightly, as if he were afraid he would accidentally hurt him. This resulted in creating the illusion that the person was quite cautious and careful. Xie Lian's head was lowered. He allowed the other person to lead him before slowly leaving the sedan. When he looked down, he glimpsed a pile of wolf and base slave corpses by his feet. They looked as if they had been strangled to death by the silk cloth Rui. Xie Lian's thoughts took a slight turn before he stumbled slightly. With a startled gasp, he began to fall forward. The person who came immediately placed his hand onto Xie Lian's back to support him. Thus, he managed to catch him before he fell. Since he supported him, Xie Lian took the opportunity to easily grab his wrist. However, he only felt something cold and hard. It turned out that the person who had come wore a pair of silver vambraces. These vambraces were gorgeous and exquisite. There were ancient patterns decorating them. Maple leaves, butterflies, and sinister, ferocious beasts were also engraved on them. They looked quite mysterious, unlike something from the Central Plains. Rather, it looked as if they were an antique from a minor exotic tribe. They perfectly enclosed this person's wrists, making him appear refined and agile. Ice-cold silver, deathly pale hands. They seemed lifeless. However, they also seemed to contain a murderous spirit and evil intentions. Xie Lian had faked that fall of his, intending to feel the other person out. Even now, Rui was still hidden in his wide sleeves, as it slowly twisted around his wrists, waiting for the moment to pounce. However, the person who came only held his hand once more, before leading him forward. On one hand, Xie Lian's head was still covered with that veil, so he couldn't see clearly. On the other hand, he wanted to stall for time. This was why Xie Lian deliberately walked very slowly. However, unexpectedly, the other person actually cooperated with his pace and walked extremely slowly as well. Every now and then, this person's other hand would support him and pull him along, as if he was afraid Xie Lian would fall again. Although Xie Lian was extremely vigilant and on guard, when he saw how the other person treated him, he couldn't help but think, if this person really was a bridegroom, he was truly being gentle and considerate to the extreme. At this time, Xie Lian suddenly heard an extremely clear, tinkling noise. Every time the two of them took a step, that clear noise would ring once. Just when he was pondering over what this noise was, the suppressed roars of wild beasts abruptly appeared from all directions. Wild wolves. Xie Lian's figure moved slightly as the rui on his wrist suddenly tightened. Who knew that, before he could do anything, the person holding his hand lightly patted his hand twice, as if he was comforting him and telling him to not worry. These two pats were light enough to be considered as an extremely gentle move. Xie Lian was slightly startled before he realized that those low roars were already disappearing. When he tried to carefully listen again, Xie Lian suddenly discovered that these wolves weren't roaring or snarling. Instead, they were whimpering. These noises were clearly the sounds a wild beast made when they were frightened to the extreme. They were the whimpering the beasts made when they were unable to take a single step, the sobs during their final struggle before death. Xie Lian's curiosity concerning the person became even stronger. At this moment, he only wanted to take off his veil and take a look at him before doing anything else. However, he knew that this action was not something proper. Thus, Xie Lian could only peek through the small crack in the veil, before trying to piece together an image, despite missing the big picture. With this glimpse, Xie Lian saw the hem of a red robe, and under that red robe was a pair of black leather boots. They were currently walking at a leisurely pace. This person's pace was a bit careless, mixed with a light and brisk bounce in his steps. It made him appear like a lively teenager. However, he walked as if he had a goal or destination firmly in mind, making it so that it seemed like no one could stop him. Whoever dared to block his path would only be crushed into dust. This rather made Xie Lian unable to precisely determine what kind of person this guy was. While he was still turning over guesses in his mind, a white and ghastly thing suddenly appeared in his view. That was a skull. Xie Lian's pace stagnated for a moment. With only a single glance, Xie Lian was able to tell that there was something wrong with the position of this skull. This was clearly the corner of some sort of spiritual array. If one touched it, Xie Lian was afraid that the whole array would launch an attack at that point. However, with the teenager's current pace, it seemed like he hadn't noticed something was there. Xie Lian was just pondering over whether he should give the teenager a warning when he heard a caca noise. With this tragic crunching noise, Xie Lian blankly watched that person's foot step onto the skull and shatter it into dust. Then, as if he hadn't felt or noticed anything, this person indifferently stepped on the skull dust and kept on walking. Xie Lian, this guy, actually just with a single step, crushed this entire array into useless dust at this moment. The teenager's pace suddenly paused. Xie Lian's heart moved, thinking it was because the other boy was about to do something. However, that teenager only stopped for a second before he continued to lead him forward. After 2 steps, some soft thudding noises echoed from above their heads, like the sound of rain hitting an umbrella. It turned out that a moment ago, the teenager had opened an umbrella before holding it above both of their heads. Although it wasn't the time to think this, Xie Lian couldn't help but praise the teenager for being so thoughtful. However, he felt this was rather odd. Was it raining? Within the quiet and dark mountains, within the forest filled with thick weeds in the distant depths of the mountain range, a group of wild wolves faced the moon and howled. Xie Lian didn't know if it was because a slaughtering fest had just occurred, but within the cold air, the light scent of blood slowly emerged. This situation and this scenery were both demonically alluring. However, this teenager held his hand with one hand and held up an umbrella with the other, as he slowly led him forward. For no reason at all, this made their stroll seem romantic and flirtatious, like they were sincerely in love and inseparable. That bizarre bout of rain came in a strange manner and left in a strange manner as well. It didn't take a long while before the sound of raindrops hitting the umbrella disappeared. And that teenager also came to a halt. It seemed like he had put away his umbrella. Simultaneously, he finally let go off Xie Lian's hand before walking a step closer to him. The hand that had held his and led him all the way here lightly touched his veil before slowly lifting it up. Xie Lian had been waiting for this moment for their whole walk here. He didn't move at all as he watched the lingering red curtain in front of his eyes slowly disappear. The silk cloth Rui moved. It wasn't because this teenager had revealed any killing intent. Rather, Xie Lian intended to take the initiative and attack first. They could have a nice chat after the other person was unable to move. Who would have thought that after the silk cloth Rui flew out, it brought along a burst of harsh wind. The scarlet veil left the teenager's hand, flying up before falling. Once more, Xie Lian only had the time to see the afterimage of a teenager dressed in red before Rui rushed over. Unexpected, that teenager suddenly shattered into 1,000 silver butterflies. They scattered into a burst of silvery light, looking like a glistening and dazzling stellar wind. Although this really wasn't the time or place, Xie Lian couldn't help but marvel at this scene after he retreated 2 steps. This sight was really too gorgeous, as if it was a fantasy scene only seen in one's dreams. At this moment, a silver butterfly began leisurely flying in front of him. Xie Lian didn't manage to carefully examine it before the butterfly flew around him twice. After that, it integrated itself back into the glistening wind, transforming into part of the silvery light filling the sky, with a flap of their wings. The butterflies flew upwards. After quite a while, Xie Lian finally snapped himself out of his daze. In his heart, he mentally wondered, in the end, Was this teenager the ghost bridegroom or not? In his opinion, he kept feeling as though this teenager wasn't. If he was the ghost bridegroom, then the wild wolves in Mount Yujun ought to have been his subordinates. But if that was the case, why would those wolves be that scared when they saw him? In addition, that spiritual array they saw on the road, here should have been one that had been set up by the ghost bridegroom. However, that teenager had just casually crushed the array into rubbish. On the other hand, if that teenager wasn't the ghost bridegroom, why would he come to rob the sedan of its bride? The more Xie Lian thought, the stranger he thought this situation was. Xie Lian threw the silk cloth rui onto his shoulders, as he mentally thought, let's forget about it. There's also the probability that he had been someone who had been coincidentally passing by. For now, let's put him to the side. The reason for why I'm here is what's more important. Xie Lian took a look around before letting out a surprised sound. It turned out that in the distance, there was actually a building. It looked quite heavy and grounded as it stood there. Since the teenager brought him here, and since this building had been painstakingly hidden in this befuddling array, it became imperative for Xie Lian to go in and take a look. Xie Lian took a few steps forward before he suddenly stopped. He thought for a moment before going back and picking up the wedding veil that was on the floor. Patting the dust off of it, he held it in his hand before walking toward the building again. This building's red walls looked quite tall, with bricks that looked conspicuously modeled. It actually looked similar to an old temple for the god of the city. In addition, based on Xie Lian's experience, the structure of this building made it probable that it was a martial god's temple. Sure enough, Xie Lian raised his head and saw 3 big words engraved in the metal on the top of the front door. The words said, Mingguang Temple, the martial god of the north, General Mingguang. He was precisely the god Ling Wen had mentioned last time in the spiritual communication array. The General Pei, whose incense sticks burned prosperously in the north. No wonder they hadn't found a Mingguang temple in the vicinity and found a Nanyang shrine instead. It turned out that the Mingguang temple in this area was within Mount Yujun. However, this temple had long been sealed off by a befuddling array. Could it be, perhaps, there was some connection between the ghost bridegroom and General Mingguang? However, toward this General Mingguang, one could say he was someone proud of his success and arrogant in his power. In addition, his position in the north was also very stable. Xie Lian personally didn't believe that this kind of martial god would willingly be involved with such a vicious thing like the ghost bridegroom. On the other hand, something like unluckily allowing a vicious thing occupy their place when they weren't aware of anything wasn't something strange. As for what the truth behind everything was, it was better to make one's conclusions after looking things through more. Xie Lian walked over. The temple door was closed, but it hadn't been locked. Thus, it opened after a single push. After he opened the door, a strange odor assaulted his senses. It wasn't the smell of dust found in a place that had been uninhabited for a long time. No, it was a faint, rotten stench. Xie Lian walked in and closed the front door, making it seem as though no one had entered the temple in the first place. In the center of the main hall, a godly statue was located on the altar for offerings. Naturally, this godly statue depicted that martial god from the north, General Mingguang. Many humanoid objects, for example, sculptures, puppets, and portraits, were all things that were easily infected by evil influences. Therefore, the very first thing Xie Lian did was walk forward and carefully examine this godly statue. After taking a long look, Xie Lian's conclusion was, this godly statue was modeled very superbly. It held a double-edged sword as it wore a belt made out of jade on its waist. In addition, it had a handsome face and looked imposing and impressive. There was no problem with this godly statue. Moreover, that rotten odor wasn't coming from this statue either. Thus, Xie Lian stopped caring about it and turned around. He decided to head toward the back of the main hall to take a look. However, the moment Xie Lian turned around, he froze in his place as his pupils shrunk. A group of women wearing crimson wedding dresses and covered with veils stood stiffly in front of him. In addition, that faint, rotting odor was drifting over from the bodies of these women. Xie Lian quickly calmed down before counting those women. 1, 2, 3, 4 he counted. All the way to 17. They were really the 17 brides who had gone missing in the Mount Yuzhan region. The red color on some of those brides' wedding dresses looked a bit faded, and the clothes themselves looked ragged and old. These brides ought to have been the ones who had gone missing first. On the other hand, some of the brides' wedding dresses looked brand new. The style of the dresses was also currently popular as well. In addition, the smell of a rotting corpse that came from these brides was also quite light. These brides ought to have been the ones who had gone missing recently. Xie Lian thought for a moment before uncovering the veils of one of the brides. The face revealed under the scarlet veil was extremely pale. The skin tone was so white, it actually looked a bit green. Lit by the dim moonlight, she looked terribly frightening. The scariest thing about her, however, was that although this woman's muscles had twisted after death, on that twisted face, she still wore a rigid smile. Xie Lian took off the veil of the girl beside her. Once again, this girl's mouth was curved up in the same smile. In fact, all of the dead people in this room wore wedding garments, while smiling even in death. Beside his ear, Xie Lian seemingly began hearing that child's voice as they sang that strange song. New bride, new bride, new bride, new bride on the red marriage. Sedan eyes brimming with tears, passing the mountain's mound. Under the veil do not hold a rising smile. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise that seemed to originate from outside the temple. It was truly a strange sound. It was so strange. It was hard to describe what it sounded like. In fact, it sounded kind of like two sticks drumming the floor, while rolled up in thick fabric. It also sounded like there was something heavy attached to the moving thing, so they were dragging it across the floor with difficulty. This noise started off from far away, but moved extremely quickly. In a flash, it sounded like it was outside the temple's front door. With a long creak, the door of the temple was pushed open. Regardless whether it was a person who came, or some other kind of thing, it was most likely the ghost bridegroom. And right now, it had already returned home. There was no exit at the end of the main hall, and there was also nowhere for him to hide. Xie Lian only thought for a moment before he saw the bride standing beside him. Immediately, he covered his head with his wedding veil again before standing within the group of brides, becoming silent and motionless. If there were only 3 to 6 bodies here, then of course it would be easy for others to notice something wrong with a single glance. However, right now there were 17 corpses here. Unless someone counted them one by one like Xie Lian did, it would be very hard for them to immediately realize that someone was hiding there. He had just placed himself in the crowd of brides, when he heard something clop their way into the room. As Xie Lian stood there motionlessly, he began pondering over what this sound was. In the end, what was this? With the pauses between each noise, it kind of sounds like a person's footsteps. However, what kind of thing would have this kind of footstep? This definitely wasn't the teenager who had brought me here. That guy walked in a very unhurried and pleasant manner, and the jingling sound of bells accompanied his steps. Suddenly Xie Lian thought of something. His heart immediately tightened. This was bad. The height was wrong. After all of these corpses were bodies of women, but he was a genuine man. He was naturally much taller than these corpses. Although nobody could tell there was an additional person in this crowd at first glance, it would be easy for them to notice that there was someone who looked particularly tall. But after thinking things over a bit more, Xie Lian immediately calmed down. He was indeed quite tall. However, That young lady Little Ying only combed his hair into a simple hairstyle. She didn't do much with it. On the other hand, these brides were all dressed up. Their hair was combed up so high, those strands were practically soaring to the sky. In addition, thanks to the phoenix crowns they wore, the top of their heads became a huge chunk taller. If they added everything together, some of these brides probably wouldn't be shorter than him. Even if he was tall, it wouldn't be too ac. Just as he was thinking that, Xie Lian once again heard the clopping noise from before. This time, it sounded like it was only to Zhang away. After a moment, he heard the clopping noise again. It sounded like it was even closer to him now. Xie Lian finally realized what this ghost bridegroom was doing. It was lifting every bride's veil as it checked the faces of the corpses one by one. Bang! If he didn't make a move now, when would have been a better time? The silk cloth Rui flew out before slamming into the ghost bridegroom. Then he heard a loud noise before a black fog began filling up the room. Xie Lian didn't know whether this fog was poisonous or not. Since he didn't have any spiritual energy protecting his body, he immediately stopped breathing as he covered his nose and mouth with his hand. At the same time, he urged the silk cloth Rui to dance and create wind, in an attempt to quickly disperse the fog. Suddenly, he heard the clopping noises again. Xie Lian squinted before he saw a short and small shadow